Hey everyone, I've got something really eerie to share with you tonight. This story came from one of you, a listener who sent in an email about a strange and horrifying experience on a Christmas train ride. I never thought I'd be sharing something like this, but after hearing what they went through, well, let's just say, it changed my view of holiday travel. If you're ready for a terrifying journey, keep listening. It was a cold December evening when I first boarded the train. The kind of cold that bites deep into your bones, making it impossible to shake off. The station was practically empty, only a few scattered souls waiting for their trains, a thin layer of fog creeping along the tracks. The Christmas lights outside the station blinked in bright reds and greens, almost too cheerful against the stark white of the winter night. I wasn't planning to take this train, but something about it seemed to pull me in. I'd been traveling across the country for work and was heading home to my small town, nestled far away from the chaos of the city. It wasn't until I stepped onto the train that I realized how wrong I'd been to trust my instincts. The train car was dark, with only the dim glow of overhead lights flickering as if they were struggling to stay on. I found my seat in a corner, as far away from the few other passengers as possible. The air was thick with an unsettling quietness, broken only by the occasional clinking of a conductor's ticket punch. But then, something odd caught my eye, something I couldn't explain at first. The train seemed older than it should have been. The windows were fogged up, condensation running down the glass, and the floors creaked with every step, like they were bearing the weight of something far heavier than just a few travelers. I shrugged it off at first. Old trains had that kind of character, right? I glanced around again, and that's when I saw a woman sitting alone, staring out the window. Her hair was white as snow, even though she looked no older than anyone else. She wore a dark green coat with a red scarf, a strange contrast against the otherwise drab interior. What struck me the most, though, was her eyes. They were wide and unblinking, locked on the glass, as if she were seeing something far beyond the snow-covered trees outside. The train started moving, and with it, a low rumble echoed through the car, setting a chill down my spine. The lights flickered again, and I heard a distant sound like someone whispering, but the words were too faint to make out. I looked around, half expecting someone else to acknowledge it, but no one else seemed to notice. Then, as the train sped along, I realized something terrifying. The landscape outside the windows was wrong. The thick woods should have been giving way to open plains, but instead, the same stretch of forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, a wall of trees that never broke, no matter how far we traveled. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The woman with the white hair turned to me, her eyes locking onto mine for the first time. She didn't smile, didn't speak, just stared as if she were trying to communicate something with her gaze. "You see it too, don't you?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "See what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The forest," she said, her words chilling. "It never ends." Before I could respond, she turned away again, her eyes once more focused on the window, as though she had already given up trying to explain. But what she said lingered in my mind, twisting and gnawing at my thoughts. The trees outside continued to pass by, endless and unchanging, as if we were trapped in some kind of loop. I stood up, suddenly feeling the need to get off the train. But when I made my way to the door, I found it locked. No matter how hard I pulled, it wouldn't budge. The air around me grew heavier, like a pressure building in the space, and I could feel it settling in my chest. I turned back to the woman, but when I looked her way again, she was gone. The seat she had been sitting in was now empty, as if she had never been there at all. And yet, the faint smell of her perfume lingered, mixing with the scent of the damp, cold air. I should have left the moment I stepped on that train, but now I was alone in a car that felt more like a coffin than a vehicle, and the only sound was the faint whispering, growing louder, closer. I stood frozen, staring at the empty seat where the woman had been just moments ago. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the shadows in the corners of the car grew long and distorted. The low, steady hum of the train filled the silence, but it did nothing to comfort me. The whispering continued, more distinct now, like voices speaking from far away, but drawing closer with every passing second. I turned quickly, half expecting to see someone else approaching from behind, but the aisle was empty. I was still alone in my corner, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't. The whispering grew louder. I rushed to the nearest window, hoping to break the suffocating air in the train, to see something that would remind me I was still in the real world. But when I looked out, I saw nothing but the same endless stretch of forest. The snow had stopped falling, and now everything outside was still too still. No wildlife, no movement, nothing. I banged on the glass, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had to be a town, a sign of civilization, something, but there was nothing. Just the thick woods swallowing us up whole. My breath came out in ragged bursts, fogging up the window, and I wiped it away, looking desperately for some sign that this wasn't happening. But the scene remained unchanged. I heard the footsteps then slow, deliberate, echoing down the narrow aisle. I turned sharply, heart pounding. A man appeared at the far end of the car, walking toward me. He was tall, dressed in a long, dark coat, with his face hidden in shadow. There was something unnatural about his movements, like he wasn't quite walking but drifting, like his feet barely touched the floor. His eyes were the first thing I noticed. They were dark, almost blackened. They locked onto mine with a piercing intensity. I felt my stomach drop. His gaze seemed to see right through me, as though I wasn't even there. He stopped a few feet away, still staring at me, unblinking. "Are you lost?" he asked in a voice that sounded far too calm for the situation, like he was asking about the weather rather than something far more sinister. His voice had an odd echo to it, as if it came from some place far away. I swallowed hard, not trusting myself to speak. I wasn't sure if I should run or demand answers, but my body refused to move. I felt paralyzed, caught in his gaze. "You shouldn't be here," the man continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, barely audible over the train's hum. "This is a place for those who have already left." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Left?" I repeated, my voice shaking. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the car, his eyes flicking over the empty seats, then back to me. His lips twitched, almost as if he were smiling, but there was no warmth in it. "They don't know they're gone, but you will. You'll know soon enough." I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but before I could, the train lurched, as if something had shifted beneath us. The lights above flickered, and then everything went black. A soft thud echoed through the car, followed by the distinct sound of something moving. But when the lights came back on, the man was gone. Just like the woman before him, he had vanished without a trace. I was left standing there, my heart racing, wondering if any of it had even been real. But the whispering, it hadn't stopped. It was louder now, closer, almost as if the voices were inside the train, inside my own mind. I stumbled back to my seat, unable to process what had just happened. The train was moving faster now, the rhythmic sound of the tracks beneath us no longer comforting. It was as if the train itself was gaining speed, pushing forward with an urgency I couldn't explain. The air grew colder. I pulled my coat tighter around me, but it did nothing to stave off the creeping chill that now seemed to come from within the very walls of the car. The smell of damp wood filled my nose, and a strange, musky odor I couldn't place seemed to be creeping in from the ventilation system. I looked around, half expecting to see someone else, to find a conductor or even another passenger, but the train remained eerily empty. Then, something caught my eye just beyond the door at the end of the car. A shadow moved, slow and deliberate, just out of the corner of my vision. I turned my head, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the aisle, dressed in black, its face hidden in the shadows. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I stood up, my legs shaky as I tried to make my way toward the door, toward whatever lay ahead, anything to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the train. As I walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoed through the car, almost too loudly. When I reached the end of the car, I grabbed the door handle and pulled with all my strength. It was locked. I tugged again, harder this time, panic rising in my chest. I turned, my eyes scanning the car, and that's when I saw it at the far end. Standing just beyond the darkness of the next car, the silhouette of something moving. It wasn't a person. It was something else. I froze, my blood running cold. The figure slowly stepped forward, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't walking on two legs. It was dragging itself, its limbs twisting in unnatural ways as it slid across the floor. I stumbled backward, unable to take my eyes off it. The creature didn't speak, didn't make a sound, it just moved closer, its shape becoming clearer in the dim light. It was tall, too tall, and as it came into the faint glow of the lights, I saw its face, or what was left of it. The skin was pale, stretched tight over bone, and its eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with something inhuman. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, and then I heard a voice in my ear, low and raspy. "You should have gotten off when you had the chance." My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears, a frantic drumbeat echoing through my chest. The floor beneath it groaned, the sound of its claws scraping the surface making my stomach turn. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the floorboards as I tried to get as far from it as possible. But the train car seemed to stretch out endlessly, and no matter how much distance I put between us, it was always just a few steps away, its shape growing clearer with every heartbeat. The smell of rot filled the air, sickly and heavy, and I felt a deep, suffocating dread creep over me. I tried to call out for help, but my voice caught in my throat, choked by fear. The creature stopped moving for a moment, and its head tilted in a way that was not human and natural, like it was studying me, savoring the fear I couldn't hide. "You shouldn't have stayed," it rasped, the voice unmistakably human but twisted by something far darker. "This train is a place for lost souls, not those who still cling to the world outside." I backed into a corner, my chest tightening. "What do you want from me?" I gasped, my breath shallow and quick. My hands were trembling as I pressed them against the cold wall, desperate for something solid to ground me in reality. The creature didn't answer immediately. Instead, it stepped closer, and as it did, I saw something horrifying, a trail of blackened, brittle skin hanging from its limbs, like remnants of something that had once been alive. It reached out a hand toward me, its fingers long and twisted, and I recoiled in terror. Suddenly, the train lurched again, the lights flickering violently as the world outside the window blurred into a dark, swirling mass. The forest, no longer even resembling the world I knew, began to warp, the trees twisting and bending in impossible angles, as if they were part of a nightmare. The whispering was back, louder now, a chorus of voices all around me, pressing against my mind, filling my ears with incoherent murmurs. I could hear them now, unmistakable. They were all calling my name, each voice more desperate than the last. A flash of movement caught my eye. The woman, the one I'd seen earlier, was standing just beyond the doorway at the end of the car. Her pale, unblinking eyes were fixed on me again. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, several other figures had appeared, shadowy figures that looked like they had been waiting for something. They moved like they were part of the very darkness itself, their outlines flickering in and out of view. The creature in front of me made a low, growling noise, its head snapping around to face the new arrivals. For a brief moment, the two groups, the figures at the end of the car and the creature before me, seemed to lock eyes, and there was a sense of something ancient, something wrong, brewing in the air. The woman with the white hair spoke first. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, considering the horrors that surrounded us. "You shouldn't have stayed on this train," she said softly, her gaze never leaving mine. "You've joined us now. There's no going back." The figures behind her began to step forward, their movements slow, deliberate, and eerie. They had the same empty, hollow eyes as the woman, as if they were all trapped in some timeless, unyielding place. And that's when I realized, these weren't just passengers, they were lost souls. "Why me?" I managed to choke out. my voice barely more than a whisper. The weight of everything, the horror that pressed down on me, was too much to bear. The woman stepped closer, her face still unreadable. "You were chosen," she said simply, as if that answered everything. "This train only stops for those who are meant to ride it, for those who have unfinished business." The creature behind me gave a low, guttural sound, like a growl rising from deep within its chest. I turned to face it, and for the first time, I saw the full scope of its features. Its skin was a sickly, grayish hue, hanging loosely from its bones, and its mouth was unnaturally wide, stretching back into a twisted grin full of sharp yellow teeth. I could see the deep hollows of its eyes that were empty, dark, without any trace of humanity. It stepped forward, and the air around me grew colder, heavier, suffocating. I tried to move. The whispers in my mind grew louder, pressing in on me, pulling me into their grip. The woman with the white hair took another step toward me, her cold eyes never leaving mine. "This is where you belong now. There's no escape." A sharp pain exploded in my chest, and I gasped, clutching at my heart. The creature's hand was there, pressed against my chest, its claws digging into my flesh. I could feel the coldness of its touch seeping into my skin, as though it was draining the very life from me. "No, no, please," I begged, struggling to pull away. But the creature's grip only tightened, its laugh low and menacing. And then, the train shook violently. The whole car rattled as though it were coming apart. The lights blinked out completely, plunging us into darkness. I heard the sound of metal grinding against metal, and the sensation of falling into nothingness. The creature's grip loosened, and for a split second, I thought I might have a chance to escape, to break free of whatever nightmare this was. But then, the woman's voice echoed through the blackness. "You will never escape, not while the train still runs. We are all bound to it, all of us." The darkness around me was thick, suffocating, like a heavy blanket that smothered everything in its path. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face, let alone the creature or the woman with the white hair. But I could feel them. The presence of the beings around me lingered like an oppressive weight, the air thick with a sense of inevitability. The train rumbled beneath my feet, its motion slower now, but still relentless. Every jolt and screech of the metal tracks felt like a cruel reminder that I wasn't in control. The whispering voices that had been echoing in my ears earlier were gone, replaced by a silence so profound it was deafening. And then, from the darkness, I heard something else, a low, grinding sound, followed by a soft scraping that sent a shiver down my spine. I reached out, trying to make sense of the air around me, but my hands found only empty space. I stumbled, disoriented, unable to tell whether I was still in the same train car or if the world itself had collapsed around me. Suddenly, a soft light flickered in the distance, faint at first, like a candle struggling to stay lit in a storm. It grew brighter with every passing second, and I could hear footsteps, slow and heavy, moving closer. My heart raced again as the shape of a figure emerged from the darkness. It was the man I had seen earlier, the one with the unnerving black eyes. He was standing there, just within the glow of the light, watching me, his head tilted in that unnerving way. I froze, unable to move, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body betraying me. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice like sandpaper scraping against metal. His tone was flat, emotionless, as though he had already asked this question countless times before. "You should be." "What? What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, but I couldn't stop myself from asking. I had to know. The man stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring every moment of my terror. "You should have listened," he said, his voice low. "Now you're here with us, bound to the same fate. You were supposed to get off at the last stop, but you stayed." I swallowed hard, my breath quickening as the weight of his words sank in. What last stop? There was no stop. This train, it just keeps going. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only a terrifying emptiness. "Exactly. It never stops. The train, it's a prison. Who can't let go?" I felt the panic rise again, choking me. "What do you mean? I can't let go. I haven't done anything wrong." The man's eyes bored into mine, and his lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, but more like a grimace of pity. "It's not about what you did or didn't do. It's about what you are, and what you'll become." I backed away, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. I wasn't dead. I was just on a strange, messed up train. There had to be an explanation. There had to be a way out. I had to wake up from this nightmare. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little sense the world around me made. The train's constant motion, the eerie silence that now hung in the air, the people I'd seen, all of them, lost souls. As the woman had said, the man's voice broke through my thoughts. "You think you can leave? You think you can outrun the past? The train has already claimed you." As his words sank in, something shifted. The light flickered once more, and I felt a pressure building inside my chest. The walls of the train car seemed to warp and bend, stretching and contracting, as if the very space around me was alive. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath cloud in front of me. The man didn't move closer. Instead, he stood still, as if waiting for something. He watched me, his dark eyes unreadable, as the sounds of the train grew louder. The hum of the wheels against the tracks, the distant clink of metal, and beneath all of that, a faint whispering again. It was the voices. They were getting louder, the same voices that had tormented me, but now they were clearer, more distinct. They called my name, but they were no longer the voices of the passengers I had seen earlier. These voices were different. They sounded far too familiar. Suddenly, the train lurched violently again. The lights flickered and went out completely, plunging us back into absolute darkness. I heard a crash, followed by the sounds of something heavy dragging across the floor, scraping, shifting, getting closer. "Don't you see?" The man's voice came from behind me, cold and full of malice. "You're already a part of the train now. The only way out is to let go." I spun around, unable to stop myself, and then I saw it. The figure at the far end of the car. The woman with the white hair. She was standing in the darkness, her eyes still wide and unblinking, her hand outstretched, as if beckoning me to come closer. The other figures I had seen earlier were there too, their faces twisted with an emotion I couldn't quite place. It wasn't pain, but something far more sinister, something worse. The creature, the one that had been following me, was standing at her side, its eyes still locked on me. The air around it seemed to vibrate with a low humming sound. The creature's mouth stretched wider, its teeth glistening in the faintest flicker of light. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to cooperate. Every step I took felt like it was dragging me deeper into the nightmare. The walls of the train seemed to close in, the space growing smaller and smaller. The whispers in my head grew louder, suffocating me. And then, in a voice not my own, I heard the words, "Let go." And in that moment, I realized there was no escaping this place. The train had become my tomb, and I had become just another lost soul. The words echoed in my mind, a relentless chant that pulled at the very core of my being. Let go. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat slower, more disjointed. The train, the world, everything around me seemed to stretch and warp, like the edges of a torn photograph being pulled into oblivion. I could still hear the screeching of the wheels against the tracks, but now it was muffled, as if I were sinking into some bottomless abyss. The cold had deepened, my breath coming in sharp, jagged bursts, as though I were drowning. I could feel the weight of the eyes on Metha Woman, the creature, the figure standing in the darkness. They were waiting for me, watching me with the same cold, unfeeling gaze. There was no escape. The train was the only reality now. This place, this never-ending ride, was my prison. I wanted to scream, to fight, to find some way out of the suffocating grip this place had on me. But there was nothing. The whispers in my mind had become a single, insistent voice, repeating those same words. Let go. I clenched my fists, trying to fight the pull. But the more I resisted, the heavier the air became. The train swayed beneath me, its constant motion disorienting. The creature, the thing I had once thought was merely a nightmare, was closer now, its twisted limbs crawling toward me. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to see straight through me, to the part of me that was no longer human. I took a step back, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Every movement was sluggish, as though I were trapped in some thick, invisible substance, unable to escape the grasp of the darkness closing in around me. "You are one of us now." The woman's voice came from behind me, soft and soothing, almost like a lullaby. But there was no comfort in it, only the finality of it all. "There's no turning back." I turned, finally able to tear my gaze away from the creature, to look at the woman. Her face was eerily serene, her lips curled into a sad, knowing smile. "You didn't listen. You stayed, and now you'll never leave." I wanted to scream again, but no sound escaped my throat. It was like my voice had been stolen, just like everything else. The train had claimed me, and now it was part of me, bound to my soul in a way I couldn't understand. And then something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the last vestiges of defiance, the stubborn part of me that refused to accept the impossible. Maybe it was the sheer horror of what was happening. But as the creature reached out toward me, its cold, clammy fingers just inches from my skin, I felt a surge of rage, of desperation. I won't be like them. I won't die here. With a force I didn't know I still had, I threw myself forward, pushing against the oppressive weight of the darkness that surrounded me. The air itself seemed to push back, but I fought it, every ounce of my being screaming for freedom. The woman's laugh rang out behind me, cold and mocking, but I didn't stop. I ran. The train jerked beneath me, the world spinning out of control as I bolted toward the far end of the car. My mind focused only on the possibility of escape, but as I reached the door, I slammed into someone that had appeared out of nowhere. It was the man with the black eyes. I gasped, stumbling backward, but he didn't move. He just stood there, blocking the door, his cold gaze fixed on mine. "You really think you can leave?" His voice was calm, but his words were filled with an unmistakable sense of finality. "There is no leaving the train. There's no getting off once you're on." I shook my head, tears blurring my vision. "No, there has to be a way. There has to be." His eyes softened for just a moment. Pity, I realized, and then the coldness returned. "You don't understand. You were chosen. You were meant to stay." I stepped back, panic rising within me. Chosen? What does that even mean? "I don't belong here. I don't want this." "You don't have a choice," he said quietly, his voice now carrying a weight that made my knees buckle. "You belong to the train now, forever." My breath caught in my throat as the full horror of his words sank in. The train wasn't just a ride, it was eternal. A prison for those who had fallen into its grasp. A purgatory for those who had no place in the world anymore. And I had been dragged into it. I turned away, my entire body shaking as I looked for another way out. But the train had no end. It stretched on forever, each car identical to the last. And the whispering the voice had grown louder, as if they were part of the train, woven into its very structure. I stumbled, lost, the weight of it all suffocating me. And then, a voice I hadn't heard before spoke clearly, inside my head. "You are not alone." I looked around frantically, but there was no one else in sight. The woman, the creature, the man, they were all gone. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt the presence of something else, something unseen, the presence of all the lost souls that had come before me. The train was filled with them, and now so was I. You're all here too?" I whispered, my voice barely audible, but I knew the answer. The train was never empty. It was a collection of the forgotten, of those who couldn't escape, bound together for eternity. There was no going back, no way out. The train continued its journey through the unyielding dark, and I, just like all the others, was trapped on it forever. Hey everyone, before I begin, I want to tell you this is a story I never thought I'd share. It's something I've kept to myself for years, but the email I received from one of you detailing a similar experience, pushed me to finally speak about it. Maybe telling it will make it feel less real, or maybe I'll never feel free from it. I don't know. This all started on Christmas Eve a few years ago. I wasn't expecting much, it was just a simple train ride back home. But as soon as I stepped onto that train, something felt off. I was too tired to think much about it at first. It had been a long day, and I just wanted to get home. But from the moment the doors slid closed, sealing me inside, I knew something wasn't right. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a December evening. The warmth of my breath hung in the air in small, frantic clouds, and the hum of the train felt distant, as if it were coming from far away. The car I was in was old in a way that didn't feel nostalgic, but unsettling. The walls were lined with faded red velvet seats, and the flickering lights overhead gave the whole place a ghostly glow. I remember looking around at the few other passengers, all of them silent, like they were trapped in their own worlds. No one made eye contact, no one spoke, and that's when I noticed her. At first, I thought it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me, but as the train picked up speed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced to my right, toward the end of the car, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting across from me, but somehow not really sitting. Her figure was unnaturally still, like a mannequin frozen in time. She was dressed in an old-fashioned coat, the kind people used to wear in the early 1900s, with a fur collar and dark gloves. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her face pale but strikingly beautiful. And yet, something was wrong. Her eyes, those eyes were too wide, unblinking, locked on me. They were too knowing, like she could see right through me. It felt as if she were waiting for something, but what? I couldn't tell. I tried to focus on the other passengers, but when I looked back at her, she hadn't moved an inch. No one else seemed to notice her. The other passengers were either asleep or lost in their own thoughts, but I couldn't take my eyes off of her. The train lurched. I glanced out the window, thinking maybe I had imagined it, but the darkness outside wasn't normal. The snowstorm that had been raging earlier was gone. Now, the world outside was an endless, empty black void, no stars, no lights from the city, just a thick, suffocating darkness. My stomach dropped. I quickly turned my attention back to the woman, hoping she wasn't still staring at me, but of course she was. Her eyes were still fixed, and that's when I saw it. The tiniest smile tugging at the corner of her lips. A sudden chill ran down my spine. It was so cold now that I could see my breath, even though I was sitting right beneath the heater. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it did nothing to fight the sensation of being watched. The train's movement had slowed now, and the rhythmic sound of the wheels on the tracks had become erratic, as if we were driving over uneven ground. The woman didn't break her gaze. I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to look away. I tried to breathe, tried to calm myself, but the unease was growing into something I couldn't ignore. That's when the conductor appeared. He walked through the car, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his uniform as old as the train itself. His face was obscured by a thick cap. He didn't stop at anyone's seat or even acknowledge the other passengers. Instead, he came straight toward me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't help but feel like I was about to hear something I didn't want to hear. When he finally reached me, he stopped. His voice was low and gravelly, almost a whisper, but it carried across the empty air of the car. "She's waiting for you," he said, his eyes darting toward the woman. His breath misted in the air, and his face. It looked like it had been frozen for decades. "Who?" I managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. "Who is she?" The conductor didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the train car, as if he had never been there at all. I was alone again. I looked toward the woman, but she was gone. In the blink of an eye, she had vanished, leaving behind an eerie emptiness where she had sat. My heart started to race, my body on edge. I had to get off this train. But when I moved to stand, the door to the next car slammed shut. I rushed to it, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I banged on the door, but no one answered. The train, once moving steadily forward, had come to a complete stop. It was then that I heard it. A faint whisper, at first so quiet, so distant, like the wind had carried it from far away. Then the whisper grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just one voice, but many. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, desperate, pleading, terrified. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked at the other passengers. None of them seemed to notice. They were all asleep now, their heads tilted back, their eyes closed. But their faces, they looked wrong. Their skin had turned pale, and their lips were drawn tight, like they were barely holding onto their last breath. Then the door behind me opened. Slowly, carefully, I turned to see who it was, and there she was again, the woman, standing in the doorway. But now, her smile wasn't subtle. It was wide, unnatural. Her teeth glistened in the dim light, sharp and pointed, like something out of a nightmare. And that's when I understood. The train wasn't going anywhere. The doors weren't going to open. And this was no ordinary ride. The air had thickened, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating fog. The woman stood there, in the doorway, her presence chilling me to the core. Her wide, predatory grin stretched unnaturally across her face. Her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, like she could see every shadow hiding in my soul. I couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted to the spot. The whispers from earlier were no longer distant. They surrounded me, filling my ears, their words now clear and unmistakable. They were pleading, begging, but there was no mercy. Help! Don't look back. The woman's lips curled into a smile that was too wide, stretching to the point that I was sure her mouth couldn't possibly hold all of those sharp, jagged teeth. She took a step toward me, her movements deliberate, slow. Each footstep echoed like a drumbeat, a sound that rattled my bones. I felt the temperature in the car plummet. My breath came out in visible puffs, mixing with the thickening air that felt heavier with each passing second. The darkness outside had swallowed the train completely now, and there was only the faintest flicker of light left from the overhead bulbs. The shadows grew deeper, more. She was getting close. I felt my pulse quicken, my chest tightened as if a weight had settled on me. There was no escape from her eye. I could almost hear her thoughts, or perhaps it was just my mind, trying to make sense of the horror before. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Yet it felt like it was coming from inside my. "You should have gotten off when you had the chance." My heart raced. "What do you want from me?" I could barely force the words out. They sounded weak, almost foreign to my own ear. Her grin only deepened, and she leaned in closer, her breath cold against my skin. "Everything," she said, the single word filling me with a sense of impending. I stumbled backward, my legs weak and trembling. I wasn't sure how long I had been on this train anymore, but the longer I stayed, the more I felt myself slipping into the same strange fog that seemed to have claimed everyone else on board. The woman's eyes glinted in the dim, light black, empty eyes, devoid of any humanity. But before I could take another step, something changed. The train, which had been eerily silent, suddenly shuddered, the metal groaning beneath. The windows rattled, as though a violent gust of wind was battering against them. But when I looked outside, there was nothing, only blackness. A darkness so profound that I couldn't see a thing beyond the glass, as if we were stuck in the void between worlds. I turned back to the woman, but she wasn't there. The doorway was empty. I rushed to it, desperate to escape, but when I tried to open it, I found it. My breath hitched in my chest, and my panic grew. How had she disappeared so quickly, and why was everything getting worse? That's when I noticed the faint sound of footsteps coming from behind me, slow, deliberate, dragging on the floor. I turned around to face the source of the noise, my heart thudding wildly in my chest. The figure appeared in the next car. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man, but there was something grotesque about him. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, with long, slender arms that hung too. His clothes were old, tattered, like something from another era. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes were covered with some kind of thick black. He wasn't walking, not in the usual way. He was dragging himself forward, his body barely able to keep up with his legs. Each step was an agonizing scrape, as though he was barely holding on to his own. He paused when he saw me, his head tilting slightly to the side, the cloth over his eyes moving, as if he were feeling my gaze. My throat went. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, every instinct in my body screaming at me to move, to get away. But I was frozen. "She's coming for you," the man said, his voice muffled, as though he were speaking through layers of thick fabric. "You should have listened. No one leaves the I backed away, but my legs felt like they had turned to stone. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, drowning out all other sound. The man reached out a trembling hand, his fingers long and skeletal, and I saw something in his palm that made my stomach churn. A small, blood-stained. With a sudden, gut-wrenching realization, I understood. This key was the only way off the train. It was the only way to escape whatever nightmare this place had. I reached for it instinctively, but before I could touch it, the man recoiled, his face contorting in a grotesque grimace. "No, you can't leave. You are one of us." Before I could react, the door at the other end of the car swung open, and I heard the unmistakable sound of something dragging its feet across the floor, followed by a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. It was her, the woman. But this time, she was not alone. Several other figures appeared behind her, emerging from the shadows, their faces as pale and twisted as hers. The eyes of each one were hollow, black, and unblinking, and their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets with their string. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I looked down at the key, but the man was gone. The door was locked, and the figures were closing. I turned back to face the. "You should have gotten off when you had the chance," she whispered again, her voice like a promise, as the shadows behind her reached. And then everything went. When I opened my eyes again, the world around me was different. It wasn't the same train. It couldn't have been. The air smelled wrong, stale, like something that hadn't been touched in years. The car I was in now was dark, almost suffocatingly so, with only faint, flickering lights overhead, casting long, menacing shadows along the walls. The familiar hum of the train's wheels had stopped. Instead, there was only a dreadful silence, broken occasionally by the unsettling sound of something heavy scraping across the floor, or a low, distant thud that I couldn't place. I sat up, my body aching as if I had been lying there for hours or maybe even days. I couldn't remember. The last thing I recalled was the woman's chilling words, her eyes filled with that inhuman, unblinking gaze as the darkness had swallowed me. But I wasn't alone now. At first, I thought it was just the effect of the dim lighting playing tricks on my eyes. But as my vision adjusted, I saw them. They were sitting in the seats around me, still as statues. Passengers, but not really. Their eyes were wide open, staring forward, but there was no recognition in them. They were lifeless, their faces as pale as marble, their bodies stiff, like they were trapped in some unnatural sleep. I moved my hand cautiously to touch one of them, hoping, praying that I would find some warmth, some sign that they were alive. But my fingers recoiled at the cold, unyielding skin. The woman's warning echoed in my mind. "You should have gotten off when you had the chance." A chill ran through me. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in on me, and the sense that something terrible was happening outside the train grew stronger with each passing second. The shadows around me felt wrong, as if they were more than just darkness. They were alive, creeping closer, twisting like tendrils trying to ensnare me. I stood up, my legs shaky but determined. The train was still stopped. The door to the next car was shut tight, and when I tried to open it, it was locked. Panic rose in my chest, but I couldn't allow myself to lose control, not yet. Instead, I walked down the length of the car, looking for some kind of exit, a sign, anything. The silence was deafening, but then I heard something whispers, soft, barely audible, like a rustling breeze through dead leaves. It was coming from the far corner of the car. I turned toward the noise, my body tensing, my heart pounding. Slowly, I moved closer, my feet dragging along the cold floor. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became. There, huddled together in the darkest corner, I saw them. Faces. Hundreds of them. The figures were huddled in a mass, their faces pressed against the cold windows of the train, staring out into the void. They were all silent now, their mouths closed. But their eyes, they were alive, their pupils dilated in terror. The air around them felt thick with dread, and I could almost hear their silent screams. I couldn't tear my gaze away from them. Something about their faces, something about the way they stared into the nothingness outside felt like a warning. "Get out," one of them whispered hoarsely, its voice barely a rasp. "Don't look out there," another one choked out, its voice cracking with fear. I wanted to ask them what was happening, but I couldn't find my voice. The words caught in my throat like the weight of the nightmare was squeezing it shut. And then, without warning, the lights above us flickered and went out, plunging the entire car into complete darkness. The whispering stopped. I stood still, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. Something moved in the dark, something that wasn't human. I could feel its presence, its weight. The train felt heavier, like it was being pulled down by something unseen. Then I heard it, a low, rasping breath. I spun around, desperate to find the source, but there was no one. No one but the pale, lifeless faces that stared back at me. And then, as if it had always been there, I saw the shadow. It was a figure, tall and thin, standing at the far end of the car. It was just barely visible in the faintest light. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin, like something twisted beyond recognition. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see its face. The shadow was watching me. The whispers started again, but this time, they weren't just words, they were commands. "Stay. Don't look back. You belong here now." My legs finally reacted, pushing me toward the door at the other end of the car, my hands scrabbling against the cold metal handle, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled, it was locked tight, as if it had been sealed with iron. I turned back, my chest tightening. The shadow was closer now, a black mass that seemed to swallow the light around it. It was moving toward Menno, gliding toward Meat's limbs, stretching unnaturally long, its presence filling the entire car. "Leave her alone." The voice was harsh, frantic. It came from one of the passengers, the man who had spoken to me earlier. His face was still lifeless, but his voice had weight. He had seen something I hadn't. He had felt something that I was only just beginning to understand. But it was too late. The shadow reached out with long, spindly fingers, wrapping them around my wrist with an iron grip. My breath hitched, and I screamed, struggling to break free, but it was no use. The shadow was too strong, its fingers cold like ice, its presence suffocating. And then, everything went black. When I awoke, it wasn't the same darkness I'd known before. The cold, suffocating grip that had held me was gone, but I felt heavier, like I had just woken from a long and unsettling dream. My body was stiff, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still on the train. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light, but I couldn't make sense of where I was. I was lying on a cold stone floor, nothing like the metal or the worn carpet of the train. The air felt thick, heavy with the smell of mildew and rot, and the temperature was shockingly colder than before. I pulled myself into a sitting position, my legs shaky, as if they hadn't supported me in a long time. My hands were trembling, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. Where was I? The last thing I remembered was being pulled into something else by that shadow. The way its long, thin fingers wrapped around my wrist, pulling me away from the train. I had tried to fight back, but it was useless. Then, the blackness. A deep, overwhelming void that swallowed me whole. And now, this. I stood up slowly, my limbs aching as if every step I took had been dragged out of me. The place I found myself in looked nothing like the inside of a train. No windows, no seats, just cold stone walls, slick with moisture. I could hear the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. I glanced around, my breath catching in my throat. There were no signs of the other passengers, no sign of the woman or the shadow. But there was something else. A door stood at the far end of the room. It was old, rusted, and half-rotted, but it was the only way out. I moved toward it, each step echoing in the silence of the room. As I got closer, I could feel it something watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and the air seemed to grow colder, thicker with every breath I took. I reached the door and pushed against it, but it didn't budge. My pulse quickened, and my mind raced, frantic for an explanation. What was this place? What had happened to the train? Was I still on it? Was I still alive? A soft sound, barely audible at first, caught my attention. Footsteps. Light, almost imperceptible. I turned toward the sound, and there, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure, a woman. She was dressed in tattered, old clothes, her hair unkempt and wild. She stood motionless, staring at me with eyes that were wide and empty, her mouth slightly open as if she were about to speak, but no sound came. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and fear surged through me like a tidal wave. The woman didn't move, she didn't make a sound, but I could feel her presence pressing in on me, like she was taking up all the space in the room. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she began to speak. Her voice was low, raspy, barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have gotten on the train." Her words cut through me like a knife. A chill ran down my spine and my breath hitched. I had no words, no way to respond. How could I? "You're already too late." My mind screamed for me to run, to get away, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Her eyes were still locked on me, unblinking, and the longer I stared into them, the more I felt like I was sinking into a vast black ocean. Before I could move, the door behind me burst open with a violent crash, sending me stumbling backward. I barely caught myself before I fell, and then I saw them. The figures, hundreds of them, spilling into the room, their faces distorted in agony, their eyes hollow and dead, locked in eternal terror. They moved slowly, dragging their feet, their bodies limp and uncoordinated like marionettes whose strings had been cut. The passengers. I wanted to scream, but the words got stuck in my throat. I turned toward the door, the only way out, but it was now completely blocked by the figures. I was trapped in this dark, decaying place with them, and there was nowhere left to run. The woman stepped forward, her gaze never leaving mine, her mouth stretched into a twisted grin, wide enough to show teeth that were jagged and sharp. "You can't leave," she whispered. "You never will. No one does." The room grew colder. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the whispers of the dead passengers filled the air, swirling around me in a maddening cacophony of tortured voices. I stumbled backward, my mind in a frenzy, trying to make sense of what was happening. I turned to the wall, desperate to find something, anything that would help me escape. But the room was closing in on me, and the shadows seemed to grow deeper, darker, more suffocating with every passing second. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I felt something. A hand, cold, damp, and heavy, wrapping itself around my wrist. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. It was the man, the one who had spoken to me earlier. His face was now a twisted mask of pain, his eyes empty, his skin stretched tight across his bones. "You should have listened," he whispered, his voice barely audible, the words lost in the thick air. "There's no way out now." I pulled away from him, but his grip tightened, and I felt the chill of death seep into my bones. His eyes darkened, and his mouth opened in a grotesque scream, but no sound came out. The other passengers were closing in on me now, their bodies reaching out with long skeletal hands, their faces frozen in horror. I tried to run, tried to escape, but the room was closing in too fast. There was nowhere to go, no light, no warmth, no way out. And then, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I heard a single voice, clear and cold as ice. "You belong to the train now." The darkness suffocated me, wrapping its cold, invisible hands around my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. My head spun, the sound of 1,000 whispers crashing against my mind, all blending together in a maddening chorus of fear, pain, and sorrow. I didn't know how long I had been trapped in that cold, claustrophobic place. Time had lost all meaning. My body felt numb, disconnected, as if I were floating in some vast, empty void, unable to escape. The voices of the dead passengers swirled around me, their distorted faces appearing in the shadows, their eyes full of accusation. I had become one of them, hadn't I? The thought gnawed at me, but there was no time to dwell on it. The air seemed to shift around me, and I suddenly felt myself being pulled forward, dragged through the pitch-black abyss. My feet didn't touch the ground, no. Something else was pulling me, something far darker than the shadows themselves. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The terror was too overwhelming, too absolute. Instead, I just drifted, carried by the force that had taken hold of me. And then I saw it. A flicker of light in the distance, growing brighter as I was pulled toward it. A train. It was the same train, the one I had boarded so long ago. The same metal rails, the same flickering lights, the same emptiness in the air. But it was different now. There was something wrong with it. Something that made my blood run cold as I was drawn toward it. The train didn't look like it was moving on tracks. It was floating, hovering above the ground, suspended in that eerie black void. I was back. As my feet finally touched the ground, I found myself standing at the threshold of the train's door, surrounded by those same pale, lifeless passengers. Their eyes locked onto me as I stepped inside, unblinking, their hollow gazes colder than the darkness outside. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The woman, the one with the grotesque grin, was standing at the front of the car. Her smile was wider now, impossibly wide. Her face stretched so thin that I could see her teeth glistening beneath the sickly light. She stepped toward me, her presence suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. "You never leave, do you?" she whispered. "The train never stops. Not for you. Not for anyone." I wanted to run, but I was frozen. The realization hit me hard. There was no escape. I had never left. This train, this cursed, was an endless loop, a never-ending nightmare, a prison. And I was one of its many passengers, destined to wander its dark, decaying halls forever. "You're just like us now," the woman continued, her voice sweet like poison. "You belong to the train just like all the others. You can never get off. You can never escape. You're a part of it now." The train creaked and groaned beneath me, its wheels grinding along invisible tracks, pulling us further into the darkness. The walls of the car began to close in around me, the passengers' hollow eyes growing wider, their bodies shifting, twitching, as if they were finally coming alive, but only enough to feed on the terror that filled the air. I looked out the window, desperate to see something, anything that could give me hope. But there was nothing, just the void, the endless, empty darkness. The train moved on, as it always had, as it always would, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I would never escape. I was a part of the train now, bound to it for eternity, along with the others who had been lost along the way. The train didn't stop. It couldn't. It was an endless ride, and there was no way off. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope you felt the fear and tension along with me. It's not over yet, perhaps. Somewhere, in another place, another time, the Christmas train still rides, waiting for its next passengers. If you want to hear more stories, don't hesitate to reach out. Until then, stay safe and never trust a train that doesn't seem quite right.